Let's go back to the phone lines, talk to Sabrina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I'd like to have the book of Leviticus, 19th chapter, 28th verse, where it says that, let's see what it says. It says, ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. Are they speaking of what is happening today with mostly the young people, the tattoos and the rings in their nose and everything?
Not necessarily, because here's the thing. You're so wise to read the verse because it's for the dead, and you appended that phrase because it's part of the passage, and the whole idea here in the passage is that God is forbidding the Israelites from wearing tattoos because they're to be separate from the practices of the pagan cultures around them. So the reason behind forbidding tattoos was not because they're intrinsically wrong, but because they were associated with paganism. So I would say today, if someone does have a tattoo, they need to examine their motive for getting a tattoo in the first place. If it is to honor God, to propagate the gospel, then I wouldn't see anything intrinsically wrong with it. However, if it is merely an association with a culture that's increasingly pagan, then we'd be doing the same thing that the Israelites were doing if they pierced themselves or had tattoos. They were associating with paganism rather than being distinct and set apart.
I see. And that what is that for the dead? They say don't do it for the dead?
Yeah, and the point being, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 18, there are all kinds of provisions there which point to practices. Those practices are practices that are associated with paganism as opposed to a belief in Yahweh, the God of Israel, ultimately expressed in Jesus Christ. So, for example, you couldn't go to a medium. Even though a medium is exercising sleight of hand and sleight of mind. You couldn't go to a spiritist. You wanted to be separate from practices like divination and astrology and sorcery and the like. Why? Because all of them point you away from the living God. So you don't want to engage in practices that point you away from the living God, but rather practices that demonstrate your faith and trust in the living God. Now, how do these practices point us away from the living God? It's an interesting question in and of itself, because, look, if I go to a sorcerer, I'm saying, you know what, I'm going to bypass God and try to get information in another way about what's going to happen in the future. Well, that's a very dangerous thing to do because God hides the future from us because He's gracious to us. If you and I knew everything that would come up in the future, we wouldn't want to face the future. So what God does, instead of blazing a floodlight down the trail of our life, He gives us enough light to step into some more light. And He gives us the grace we need to deal with the issues that we face each day. So God's grace is sufficient.
Okay, so the day it would not be, because I had a problem with the young people in my church, and I try to tell them they're all tattooed up, but I tell them, but God still loves you, and I don't want to tell them anything wrong. And then my granddaughter, she came to visit me this summer, and she had a ring in her nose, and she really said she really loved the Lord. And I asked her, why did she do that? And she said, I would still love the Lord, Grandma. And I was just wondering, would I be wrong in telling them that? I want to know.
Well, I think you have a right to be concerned, because I think there's a sense in which even young Christians who take the sacred name of Christ upon their lips are maybe more akin to baptized secular humanists, which is to say that their whole worldview is more skewed towards the culture than it is towards Christ. So I think there's a reason to be concerned. But on the other hand, I think that there's a reason to rejoice if your granddaughter is sincerely telling you that she loves Jesus Christ. She wants to follow the principles of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Well, that's great, great place to rejoice. And, again, if you have the great relationship that I'm sure you do with your granddaughter, you can ask her, why the nose ring? What would cause you to have a nose ring? What do you associate that with? What gave you the idea to do that? And maybe through the discussion, you can end up helping her understand more fully a Christian worldview and how we are set apart. But again, there are Christians who are deeply committed to Christ with nose rings, and there's a reason they're doing it. It's not to violate the principles of the kingdom. That's maybe a way for them to identify with the culture so that they can reach the culture. I don't know. But each person has to be one who examines their motives and examines their conscience, because ultimately everything we do has a consequence, not only for time, but in the resurrection of the dead for all eternity. We'll be right back with more answers to your questions, so please don't touch that dial.